Chapter 4. What is unnatural? Let's take a little closer look at the difference between the natural and the unnatural. Earlier, I said that one of the paradoxes of nature is that it is both bounded, it has limits, and is unbounded, it is limitless. What do I mean? The things of the world too, after all, seem to be both bounded and unbounded. There is, for example, no theoretical limit to how much power we can use, or how much information we can process, or how far we can progress. If we had an endless number of Earths stretching away into infinity and could hop from one to the other, we could go on world building forever. The difference between the limits of the world and those of the Earth is that natural things are bounded in size but have boundless quality, while unnatural things can grow and grow and grow, but they can never in themselves get any better. Take, for example, a natural home, a snail shell. It can only get so big in time and space before it stops. It reaches a literal limit. At the same time, its beauty is endless. If you get closer to it, its beauty does not decrease. Now take an unnatural home, one of ours, a huge modern block of flats, for example. Eventually nature will put limits on its growth, but it doesn't have its own limits. Like the cities they are part of, these hideous buildings just grow and grow and grow and grow. When I say hideous, you might think I'm making a subjective judgment. I'm not, nor am I stating an objective fact. I'm expressing a conscious truth. I'm saying that only unconscious, unnatural minds could call a modern block of flats beautiful, but even they would struggle to find it beautiful at smaller scales. The lobby of a modern building, for example, the ceiling, the corridor, the doors, all are plain, crude, ugly, unnatural. This isn't to say that large natural buildings can't be built. Winchester Cathedral, for example, not far from Reading, is one of the most beautiful buildings on earth, and it is beautiful at all scales. When the great medieval cathedrals of Europe were built, people still lived natural lives. They were hard lives, but they were still natural, which is why people wanted and were able to make beautiful buildings. Nowadays we have much more worldly power than we did 1,000 years ago, but we cannot make buildings like Winchester Cathedral anymore. We appear to have the technical power, but this same power has robbed us of the quality required to build beautiful things. How does this happen? Imagine a snail shell that grew beyond its limits. It would soon be too heavy for the snail to carry. If it were a strangely clever snail, it might actually want this. It might value the protection, or the bigger shell might get its sexier snail girlfriends, or it might have a perverse desire to be original and special. It might then, rather than reduce the size of the bulging shell, start finding ways to carry it. It might devise wheels for the shell, then roads for the wheels. Then it would need other snails to help it build these things, which would all need to be cleverly devised and laboriously maintained. Then, of course, other snails would have to grow their shells, not just to keep up with each other, but because the world was now built for bloated shells. An ordinary sized shell would just be crushed. Finally, the snails would become the servants of the world they had built. They would be the shells. And this is what has happened to us. At some point in the past, the shell of the man-made world grew in power and independence until it exceeded its limits and started to make a tool of us. We were then forced to set about constructing wheels and roads for the world shell we're all now carrying around. Worse than this, man, in order to fit himself into the world he had made, had to change not just the natural world, but himself, which led to deformations in the human psyche unknown to earlier people, and which now threaten to destroy human nature for good. Have you noticed how worldly people who have adapted themselves to the world we live in are insane? Have you noticed that they don't really feel anything, that their eyes are dead, that they are miserable, that they don't know how to socialise or form loving relationships, that they can't really do anything and don't really want to. This is just the latest and last stage in a process which has been going on for a long time, which has mutilated human beings to fit into a world which is inhuman. Chapter 5. What is technology? The snail has its shell. What do we have? What is the shell of the world which has taken over our lives? It is our tools. At some point in the past, the power and complexity of our tools crossed a threshold beyond which they stopped serving us and, like the over-bloated snail shell, started enslaving us. Before we look at how and when, we have to know what a tool is. A tool is something which extends the power of myself, which I can use to do something useful for myself, to do something which serves me. A hammer, for example, makes myself more powerful. It makes it harder and more precise. I can bash a nail into a piece of wood with the new power of hardness and precision. So a hammer is a tool, but so is a stone. Not quite as hard or precise as a hammer, but a lot harder than my soft, lumpy fist. In fact, pretty much anything is a tool. A stick is a tool, a leaf is a tool, a drop of water is a tool. My hands are tools, my legs, my eyes, and of course, so is my mind, which vastly expanded the power of the animal body it developed in. So if just about everything on earth is a tool, including my own mind, what's the problem with them? And how did they create the dystopian hell of the modern world? The answer again is they exceeded their natural limits. Let's take the transport system as an example. When human beings use their feet to get around, and then later horses and simple carriages, these tools were what we could call within reach, meaning if anything went wrong with them, we could, if the problem could be fixed, fix it ourselves. In addition, legs and carts do not require an inordinate amount of time and energy to take care of, and they do not produce any useless waste. Once the combustion engine was invented, however, all that changed. When trains and then cars passed a threshold of speed and power, they began to demand that the world be reshaped for them, and, like the insane snails, we had to work harder and harder to build and maintain their world. I don't just mean the time and effort required to save up, buy, and then take care of the family car. I mean the whole transport system, all the oil and bitumen and steel and plastic we need for all our cars and lorries and roads and container ships and railways. As a species, we have to devote an immense amount of time and effort to extracting and refining all the materials needed to get us around, so much so that we end up, again, as a society, slowing down. Travel becomes difficult, frustrating, boring, slow, and unpleasant. What's more, everywhere we go to is increasingly the same as the place we just left. But our transport system is just one tool which has exceeded our reach. The health system is another, our energy system, the legal system, our information technology, our manufacturing industries, and our security systems are all tools that have got out of hand, that have exceeded their limits and no longer and can no longer serve us. Take as one more example a handsaw. A saw is, in principle, within reach of men and women. It doesn't require much upkeep or much input from the environment. People can fix it when it goes wrong, and they can recycle the parts when it reaches the end of its life. Not so the chainsaw. It provides almost unimaginably more power than the handsaw, but at what cost? It cannot be fixed by ordinary people or ordinary communities when it goes wrong. It requires a vast industrial complex to manufacture and maintain, and it enables us to lay waste entire forests. The chainsaw is not really a tool. It is a machine. This is the word we use for a complex arrangement of tools which work together to produce a desired result. All machines, except for the very simplest ones, like a water wheel, are beyond the reach of man. What this means is that it is foolish to say that machines are neutral, or that they are useful. We may have some control about how we use a chainsaw, and the individual might be able to put it to some good use, but the chainsaw is and has to be part of the inhuman system which the individual is powerless to influence and which enslaves him. Chapter 6. What is the system? Machines don't have to be made of objects, like the chainsaw. They can be made of people and information. We call these machines institutions. If the machines are the hardware of the world, institutions are the software. Just as tools are within reach, so societies, clubs, teams, and other groups are within the power of humans to correct and adapt. And just as when tools become machines, they start taking control of us, so when groups become institutions, they too subordinate men and women. Institutions subordinate people by forcing them to adapt to the organisation of the institution. They do this in much the same way that complex machines organise their parts, ensuring that everything fits together. Machine-like institutions organise people by turning them into parts, which are called roles, and then forcing those parts to do the same thing again and again. Some parts, the more privileged roles, are given more freedom than others, but they must be essentially predictable and integrated with all the other parts. If someone wants to be independent, if they want to live in a way which cannot be predicted and which doesn't fit into an institution, they are considered to be stupid or insane. That's what mental health means, your ability to adapt to the system. If you can't adapt, you've got a disease and you need professional help. It's not just the parts of an institution which must fit together. Institutions themselves must fit together with each other and with other machines. The whole thing forming what we call the modern world or the technological system. The fact that it all fits together means that it has its own priorities. This is very important to understand because many people think that human beings decide what happens in the world. But that's not how it works at all. There are people who are, in a very limited sense, responsible for the system, the owners of the system particularly, but also its professional class, and they do have some power to make small changes. The kind of changes that you can expect from a political party, for example, or a corporation, or a teachers' union. But the system itself is autonomous. It has its own priorities and demands, which its human servants must obey or be crushed. When I say priorities and demands, I don't mean that the machine of the world is a conscious creature. I mean that it can only operate in a certain way, which forces human beings to think, feel and live in the same way. There are 3 ways that this happens. Firstly, a machine, as we have seen, has no use for quality and mystery. It has no use for paradox, for love, for beauty, or for nature as an end in itself. It therefore forces human beings to disregard these things. Secondly, a network of extremely complex machines and institutions demands vast quanta of energy, which human beings must feed it at all costs. If the energy stops flowing, everything falls apart. Thirdly, improvements in isolated parts of a complex machine require improvements in all the other parts. If you put a Ferrari engine in a 1970s Lada, it will tear it apart. You have to improve every other aspect of the car. Likewise, technological innovation forces a complete change in society in order to accommodate the change. When, for example, one aspect of British society industrialised, cotton factories, a vast number of related aspects of society had to also be industrialised, because you can't have machine fabrics without machine power, machine transport, and machine minds. every step of every progress requires an accompanying development in every other technology, not to mention in the thoughts, feelings and lifestyles of the people who must use or be subjected to the use of these technologies. This leads to all kinds of unforeseen problems, which then require more technological fixes. When we understand this, that the machine controls us, and not this or that person or class or nation, many problems in our social lives begin to make sense. Take immigration. For the past century, the technological system has demanded that huge numbers of people shuttle around the world. And so they do. Ordinary people don't like to have the places they lived in overwhelmed with foreigners, or their families fragmented and their traditions diluted. But that's neither here nor there. The technological system needs it, so everyone must put up with it. Or take another example, the destruction of childhood innocence and freedom, and therefore sanity. Again, the technological system demands it. It must have children rigidly schooled in its procedures and values, and it must have them engaging with society through the screen. Or let's consider social control. Most Western countries are heading towards a Chinese-style social credit system, in which citizens, rated for how trustworthy or contagious they are automatically disciplined through invasive systems of surveillance and control. Why? Because this is what the technological system itself demands. The super machine is inherently unstable, unnatural, and anti-human, which means the more powerful it becomes, the more rigidly it must control things and turn people into controllable things to keep it all together. Let's take one final, subtle, but terrible example of the technological system running society. People are going out of their minds. There are several reasons for this, but one is that we are, becoming redundant. I don't mean they are losing their jobs, which would be a reason to celebrate. I mean they are becoming useless, superfluous. Not just unable to do anything with any skill, but unable to contribute in any meaningful way to society and punished for even trying. Even using our bodies is becoming unnecessary in the modern world, leading to the widespread phenomenon of psychological shutdown or numbness. All this inevitably leads to ghastly feelings of futility and depression, which people are encouraged to assign to all kinds of reasons, but the real one is the technological system. The technological system must expel as many humans as possible from its operations, or, if that's not possible, expel genuinely human qualities, such as creativity, generosity, fellow feeling and so on, from the people who remain within it. Such qualities cannot be controlled, and, more often than not, they disrupt the smooth operation of the machine, so they cannot be allowed, which is why only machine people, without qualities, rise to the top in the technological system. Unempathic, cowardly, hyper-rational automatons. Meaningless people. Chapter 7. What is meaning? Today we lead meaningless lives. Most of us understand this now. Most of us can see that we are all chickens with our heads cut off, already dead, but through sheer momentum running round and round and round, going nowhere until we drop. We are all desperate for meaning, but we don't know where to find it. We all want to travel, to help starving orphans, to work in the film industry, to give it all up and live on a farm, to become enlightened, to raise a family. But somehow these things don't ever quite do it for us. We are still discontented. The cause of our malaise is we don't know what meaning is, or where to find it. There are 4 sources of meaning in our lives. First of all, and most importantly, there is the primal source of meaning, which is, as we have seen, consciousness, and the quality of merely consciously existing. Secondly, again as we've seen, there's nature, the beautiful, mysterious, selfless experience of being in the wild, or of being wild, or of immersing oneself in wild things, like the sky or an onion. The third source of meaning is each other, society or culture. We build our culture from consciousness, which is where universal quality comes from, by which I mean human qualities which we recognise in any person, no matter where they come from: courage, dignity, vitality, and so on. We also build our social world from nature, which is where particular cultural quality comes from. That which separates Kenyan customs and art, for example, from Eskimo customs and art, both of which are one with the nature, the particular nature, around them. We also build the cultural world from the various demands of living together, from our need to procreate and have fun, from the necessity of dealing with the inevitable problems that come from collective life, and from our need to nourish, clothe, and house ourselves. This leads to the fourth source of meaning in our lives: meaningful work or production, making the things we need to live and to live well. In this kind of work, man finds and expresses himself, which gives him great pleasure and confidence. The technological system has no use for any of this. Consciousness, and therefore quality, is, as we've seen, meaningless to machine thinking. Nature only has meaning if it is broken down into things and employed by the system. Society cannot be integrated into the system, nor can people who produce things for themselves. It's not just that these things are useless to the system, they are an active threat. They cannot be grasped by the machine mind, they cannot be controlled, they cannot be bought and sold, and no profit comes from them. That's why, as the machine reaches its most advanced form, we find that consciousness, nature, society, and useful work are nowhere to be found. The system has destroyed them, or it's made them inaccessible. Consciousness is filtered out at school and at work. Spontaneity, aliveness, and uniqueness are either unrewarded or they are actively punished. Try being spontaneous, alive, and completely unlike anyone else here in the world. See what happens to you. Nature is viewed by the system as a means only, without any inherent quality. Economics is unable to take it into account, and insofar as nature provides man with an independent livelihood, it must be put beyond his reach. Likewise, society and useful work. Human beings are simply not permitted to provide their own subsistence. They must get their entertainment, their sense of security, their health, and all the objects they use from the technological system, which they must be completely dependent on. And so we live, and we must live, in a meaningless world. What does that mean? Well, it means that everyone everywhere is unhappy. Go to where the system works, to your nearest large town or city, and take a look around. Everyone is constantly anxious or depressed or angry or desperate. You can see it on their faces, and you can see it in how they live their lives. You might also be able to see it in yourself. What this means is that when the machine gives people a reason for being anxious, a bad guy, for example, or a virus, they seize it and cling to it. Their aimless anxiety now has an object, and they now have steps that they can take to deal with it. What's more, they find themselves in a community of people who think the same, who are fighting the same bad guy or virus, and are united against irresponsible folk who are not afraid. Note that none of this has anything to do with education, how smart you are, or with political affiliation, how radical you are. An educated left-winger is just as unconscious, anxious, and helpless as an uneducated right-winger, because they are all systemoids, worldlings. Today, the technological system is the world. It is everywhere. It is all but impossible to escape it. Everywhere you go and everything you do occurs within an institution or a machine or in service to one. So much so, it's all but invisible. Just as the fish doesn't notice the water, so we don't notice the system. Not just because it's all there is out there, but because it exists within us. We eat its food, we reproduce its ideas, our bodies move through its rhythms, and our minds are constantly engaged with its interfaces. We are institutionalized machine people, which is why an institutional machine world doesn't just look normal, it feels normal. It feels natural. Modern man cannot see beyond this normal, because to see it means that everything must change. Not just this or that activity or habit or belief, but everything, his whole being, and consequently his whole way of life. So he goes on identifying this or that problem and pursuing this or that isolated short-term solution until he dies. Those who own and manage the machine well know that people are like this. They know that real change terrifies them, and so they make sure that problems are presented without the worrying bigger picture, and that solutions amount to nothing more than relieving immediate fears and stresses. This ensures that the passive mass are altogether caught up in the panic of the day, and all too willing to sacrifice more of their freedom and dignity for a short-term fix. A little less fear, a little less insecurity. This is how evil grows, by offering the lesser of two evils until all the good has gone.